Everybody, welcome back to Final Resonance TV and episode number 19. Today I'm with author Greg Renoff. This awesome book called Van Halen Rising, one of my favorite books because I'm just, most people know I'm a freak. Van Halen freak, yeah. You know what? I got a surprise for you later.
Okay.
So anyway, we're here in Tulsa, Oklahoma in this beautiful room, Kane's Ballroom. And tell them what's so historic about this room.
Well, a lot of things that are historic about the room. It's been here for better part of the 20th century, but for our purposes here in Van Halen, 1978, they played here in March when they were basically an unknown band. In fact, they had Ronnie Montrose they were opening for Ronnie Montrose, and so they were sort of the added attraction on the bill there, and kind of came in here the first time to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that was about a month out on the road for those guys. They'd only been out for a few weeks, and it was a big start of something even bigger.
Right, and if I didn't say it already, Greg is a historian who wrote this Van Halen Rising book, and it's one of the best, if not the only book, about their prehistory, which means from the time they came to the United States all the way through the first tour.
Right.
Right. So going back, for you anyway, let's just start with your background, where you started listening to music, the very beginning of what you started to pick up on when you were a kid, whether it was your family or whatever.
Well, when I tell the story, I like to talk about everyone has a cool uncle, or hopefully had a cool uncle. I had an uncle who was about 10 years older than me. So when I was about 12, he was about 22, and he actually ended up living with us. He had been through sort of a life turmoil, and he ended up living with us. So was my mom's younger brother, and it was about 1974, 1975, and I remember very vividly going into his bedroom in our house, and he'd be playing Allman Brothers, and he'd be playing Jimi Hendrix, and I actually remember looking at Jimi Hendrix, Isle of Wight, and some of these other records, and him telling me about how great these bands were, and it didn't really register at the time. I was very young. I was like 8, 7, 6 years old or whatever, but I sort of remember this very, very vividly, and I think that kind of laid the groundwork for me later when I became a teenager in 12 and 13, and sort of it all kind of came surfacing for me. The type of music I sort of gravitated to, the guitar-driven rock music, was what I kind of ended up liking the most, and so I heard AC/DC's Back in Black and an album like Rush, Moving Pictures, I heard in 1981. But again, that sort of was all building towards when I heard Van Halen for the first time in 1984. Like, really remember hearing Van Halen, and that was what really kind of blew my mind and made me a fan. So I like to give my Uncle Tommy credit for sort of laying the groundwork for all that stuff for me. That made me a big fan. Yeah.
I remember too. Exactly. I had an uncle.
Yeah.
And he was into Kiss. And we had.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you said this before or when in your book, but or on another interview about Kiss posters, and
sure.
You walk in and you're like, what is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when Van Halen came around, it was like I took a shift. Back, I was like, well, those guys are kind of theatrical, but Van Halen was different. So you get a guitar at some point, right?
I did. I ended up picking up an old battered acoustic guitar that was in the house that my stepfather's, and he had stopped playing, and I played it. And that was, I always think back on those times, and I think how hard I tried to become good at guitar. And I know you're quite an accomplished guitar player, but I never got past the intermediate stage, and so I was always sort of like stuck in this giant rut that went on for like a decade. And so, but for me, I definitely could play along with some songs. The solos were mostly over my head in terms of my ability. But yeah, that was another thing that definitely drove me, was in hearing Van Halen and then having the guitar around and sort of wanted me to pick up the guitar like everybody, tens of thousands of other kids across the country, hundreds of thousands of other kids. That actually made me sort of invest in the music even more.
Did you get into bands, or you just kind of played?
Oh, I did a little bit. I mean, we played around, and we played like our senior review, but I was never the guy who could be counted on not to make a mistake all the way through the song. It was one of those things. It's one of those things I just don't. I sort of maximized my musical talent to the most it was, but I just didn't have the natural. Like anyone who can sit play 6 songs in a row, or I was like, wow, beyond just sort of like hacking around with your friends. But yeah, we didn't have a band or anything now, like seriously. Yeah.
Okay, so you eventually go through high school and you get into history. How do you get into this whole history?
Yeah, so I ended up going to college, and my dad was a professor, and there was always tons of books around the house, and I just sort of always enjoyed studying the past. I don't know how to explain it. It was just something that he kind of ingrained in me. And as we were joking before, I was terrible at math, and so you're looking for a major in college. Anything with math, I was just a disaster at. So I said, I like history, and ended up getting the degree in history from Rutgers, and I ended up going and doing a master's degree at University of Mississippi in Oxford.
Okay.
So I was there, did that, and then was trying to decide if I wanted to keep going for a PhD, and I did it. I ended up going to Brandeis in Boston and getting a PhD in American history, and then ended up becoming a college professor of all things, and did that for about a decade. And so that was, I don't think there was any sort of like master plan for me to become a college professor, but that's just sort of maybe how it kind of sort of began to filter through my life with my dad. That was his profession. He was a college professor, and I just ended up doing that. So yeah.
Okay, so then what makes you go and want to do a Van Halen book?
Well, that was another.
I mean, I think we talked about this. This is like nobody had done it.
Yeah, well, there was a couple of things that were going on there. So I had been working as a professor for about 8 years, and I had time for what was called a sabbatical. It was time for me. So you basically can take 6 months where you can work on your next book. And I'd already written an academic book,
which was
The Big Tent, and it was on traveling circuses. And it's kind of interesting to think about that, because the book I wrote about traveling circuses, I realized after the fact, was sort of my way of looking through the lens of my own experiences of going to arena rock shows.
Okay.
Because the time period that I was covering was the time when the circus was this huge, this would be the late 19th, early 20th century, where the big three-ring circuses would come and put up a tent.
Right.
And they would come and they'd play, and everyone would come to these shows from out of town, and the whole town would shut down because Ringling Brothers would come to town.
Right.
So I did this book, and I was just looking for kind of a fun project, just to do something a little different before I really went out and did another academic book. This was not, Van Halen Rising was not supposed to be an academic book, and it wasn't. But what I did was I thought, well, I'll write maybe a small article on something, and I'll do it for Van Halen News, just for sort of blow off some steam or whatever for myself. And I ended up doing a little bit of digging around, and we've talked about this before, but I ended up discovering that Van Halen had been playing in Los Angeles for quite a long time, which I sort of knew from reading so many interviews about Van Halen over the period of time in the 80s, all the circus magazines, you sort of got these little clips, these little,
I had the same.
we played this club. So I sort of knew that, but then I ended up finding out on Facebook, of all things, that Van Halen had played at this club in Los Angeles called the Rock Corporation in Van Nuys, California. It was a biker bar, basically.
Yeah.
That they were there when the club owner, or working there when the club owner decided to start doing a wet T-shirt contest on stage.
Right.
And so,
is this where it was invented, though?
Yeah, it was. Well, it was sort of the first time the wet T-shirt contest was ever brought into an establishment, supposedly, because there was actually a legal case that came out of it. So, so what ended up happening? So I talked to the owner of the club, and he told me the story, and I thought, that's a pretty good story. And I said, maybe I'll just do this little fun thing for Van Halen News Desk. And that's where it sort of all started spinning out of that. And I said, you should talk to this person, I talked to that person, and just sort of all snowballed from there. But yes, I talk about that in Van Halen Rising, but what ended up happening was that wet T-shirt contest had been going on, but this guy was actually charging admission, right, for Van Halen plus wet T-shirt contest. So the Vice Squad from Los Angeles Police Department came in.
The legalities.
The legalities came in, and there's actually so there's actually a very amusing anecdote in the book about this, that the guy who the owner of the club actually was acquitted on some technicality. I'll let you read it in the book. It's quite funny, but yeah, I heard that and I said, oh, that's kind of an interesting story. I didn't really know about this, and then I ended up accumulating more and more material, and at some point you sort of get to this point where you're like, well, it could be a long article. It's not a blog post anymore. It could be like a long magazine article, maybe for like Classic Rock Magazine or something like that. Then I thought, well, or I could try to write a book. And at that point, it was sort of started to tip towards the book. I just told my wife, I was sitting there talking to my wife, and I said, I got to write this book. And she said, well, you should do it then if you really feel that passionately about it. Yeah, you should do it. And I was sort of like, this is not, at the time it didn't seem like a great idea, actually. I mean, in retrospect, it seems like it was a wonderful idea, but at the time, it's sort of, well, is anyone going to care about this stuff? It's before they're famous and the whole 9 yards we've talked about before. But,
right. But so, we always talk about whether that's a niche audience or not. Right.
And that was kind of the thing. And then at that point, I mean, you're a musician, and there are people, anyone here who does any sort of art or creative thing understands at some point you have to decide, well, it's just for me. I mean, if 10 people buy the book, great, but I want to write this book, and it's because I want to know, and that's really what it was for me. I wanted to know the story, and I wanted to put the story together of how Van Halen went from a backyard party band up to being the biggest band in rock, and sort of that whole trajectory out of nowhere Los Angeles, suburban Los Angeles, to worldwide stars. That's what I wanted.
Which none of us knew.
Yeah, and that's why that's for me. That was what I was hoping. That people would say, "Oh, this is what I want to know. This is I wanted to."
Well, we all kind of know. He was from the Netherlands, and then he came. The basics, and sort of what the documentary, the DVD from the early years, DVD that we all, I guess, looked at and watched.
Yeah.
So the early years DVD, which was all the friends, which is sort of where you link into all these people for your research.
So that was actually one of the great people I met when working on Van Halen Rising. Was a guy named Michael Kelly who appeared in that video, and he was it's the early years DVD, went straight to DVD as documentary, and he was actually really instrumental in getting me hooked up with a lot of people because Mike Kelly had been gigging basically in the same types of clubs as Van Halen. He was one of these guys who sort of crossed paths with them a couple times. He met Eddie at the Starwood, but he had this great network of people. And he was like, "Oh, you should talk to this person, that to that person." So again, that's what sort of ended up happening with working in the book. Was a lot of this was through Facebook or sort of just networking, because there wasn't. If you're going to write a book like this, you can get you get Eddie Van Halen to write it with you, and then you got Eddie Van Halen, so that's all you need. But for this, I wanted to sort of crowdsource the story, and it was not something where you could go look at old magazines, because nobody wrote articles about a band that was not famous. There was a couple of newspaper articles, but it was basically flyers and then people, and that's what it really was going to be, to sort of tell the story. And so it was really important for me to find, talk to this guy. This guy used to swap guitars with Eddie. Right.
So you had all these anecdotal stories that you had to go back behind and double check. Right. Because you're a historian. That's what you do, right? So I guess, I think I heard that in other interviews where you talked about how you went back and you clarified all the different... to make sure that what was remembered was remembered.
Sure. I mean, anything like this, anytime you write a book like this, or, look, any work of history, there's no way for anyone to actually perfectly replicate a moment in time. Right. What just happened now is gone. It's past, and we're never going to be able to fully recapture that. But for what I wanted to try to do with the book, for example, with the backyard parties, I would hear these stories initially from people, and they would say there were 1,500 people, and the helicopter came. Right. I was like, okay. And so then they'd say, well, talk to my friend Jimmy. He was there. And he talked to these people, and you start to talk to enough people. You talk to 12, 15 people, 18 people. And some of these parties were so big, pretty much everybody went to this party. I mean, and then what would be really interesting is that if I got a flyer from the party and people talked about the police coming, there would be articles. There would be occasionally some very small articles in the Pasadena newspaper that would say, be 100 words saying police break up teenage party, a loud disturbance took place in this neighborhood, it's the right address, the police dispersed it, and it all matches up. And so,
well, that's fun. The fun thing about what you're doing, though.
And that was fun. That was
sort of fun for you to.
Yeah, it was. It was not only fun, but for me, a lot of what you learn about rock bands, there's a lot of legend, but there also is this sort of scream of truth that kind of goes through it. And I was trying to, you sort of try to walk the line. You sort of say, okay, what was sort of puffed up. And to tell you the truth, for me, especially with the earlier stuff, there wasn't as much puffed up stuff when they were from non-famous, because it wasn't very interesting to people, like basically like the brown M&Ms and all this other stuff. That stuff later, those stories become much more, I think, inflated because they were famous then, where the stuff that was in the backyards was basically just people doing these things at the time, was just high school parties and stuff, and just happened to be the band that was playing these high school parties became famous and such things. But
let me ask you this about that. Then we're talking about Van Halen and why they haven't done this themselves, why they haven't, why they're not very retrospective about anything they do. Right. Do you think it's because they take the whole idea of, if it's legend, it's bigger than it would be if we uncovered everything? Like, they were big into Zeppelin. I think but Zeppelin's kind of uncovered a lot.
Sure. It's hard for me to know.
Because we talk about this.
We just speculate about this all the time. What the motivation is. Right. I know Guns N' Roses is putting out now this massive box set, sort of the building of Appetite for Destruction, and we'd all love for them to do that with Van Halen 1 or 1984. And I just I don't know, but my gut feeling at this moment in time is that the Van Halen brothers are sort of, in some level, sort of humble people who don't want to take a victory lap in some ways, and I think they feel it's sort of self-congratulatory.
Right.
Which that could be it.
I can see that.
You know, I have to think as well that they are just in a position in their lives where they just are not motivated to do it for whatever reason.
Right.
Maybe they just feel it's just kind of treading back in the past. They don't want to do that, but they've never been a band that has wanted to do this. So it isn't totally surprising that the 40th anniversary of Van Halen 1 would pass by. Although I was somewhat surprised they didn't decide to do anything at all, but to sort of not to tour I'm surprised about that. But that they didn't come out with the mystical mythical box set or something like that. But I just got the impression that that's not their thing. That they're just not. And it also may be that they have plans to do things in the future, and they sort of think once we start doing this, it's almost as if we're saying it's over for us. We're basically we're done. Like we're not going to ever make another record. Again, I have no information.
Well, you've seen the Eagles documentary, right?
Sure, right.
Which is fantastic and very dirty as far as the details go. And I don't think it's detracted from anything. I think it maybe helped them. You know,
it would be. You know, they have the same manager, Irving Azoff.
Yeah,
I'm sure Irving Azoff would think it was a great idea. Like I was saying, I'm sure Irving is full of ideas.
He's every day. He's probably trying to sell that one to him. I'm sure. Well, let me take you down a little different path with your book.
Yeah.
What I want to do is go member by member through the band,
okay, and
kind of hit highlights from the research that you've done,
sure,
and kind of talk about each person's personality because it all comes out in these. And you talk about them being sort of reserved, you know, with their history, and you know, and from your research and from what people have told you, how the personalities are.
Yeah.
So let's just start with Eddie.
Sure.
When he was, he came over from the Netherlands with his brother.
Right.
One of the things I didn't know was they didn't move right into 1881 Las Lunas. What was the couple of places before?
There are a couple of homes that were in the phone book. So that's how that ended. That was, again, talking about research. So actually, I got to give credit to my buddy Michael, who actually lives in Pasadena, and he actually went to the public library and pulled the 1962 phone book out and looked and found Jan Van Halen and found these other addresses. And so right before they moved to Las Lunas in 66 or so, they bought the house. They lived in these very, very, very modest houses. In fact, one of them, from what I was able to figure out from interviews with Eddie and talking about it, they had a shared bathroom. You can imagine it's the 1960s.
And this is multiple families?
Right, multiple families, shared bathroom. So it was basically like a two-family house that had one bathroom that two families shared. So I mean, that's pretty. Right. That's pretty.
They come over with nothing,
right,
and they've got to work their way to a house.
And so to kind of get to the house in 66, they lived in a couple of. They were just multifamily type of situations. So yeah, I mean, that to me, again, just illustrated. The family really did start from the bottom and work their way up. And it was really, to me, again, another thing that actually made me admire the Van Halen family, the brothers, the whole family. Even
because,
more.
They are that classic story.
Yes.
Right? I mean, and that's when the whole thing at the Smithsonian, which I was at, and he kind of went through at that, he illuminated a lot of that in his story. So that house, you see those pictures of them practicing in the front with the broken combs or whatever in there. I guess it's in the front foyer there. You said his bedroom was in the sunroom out back.
Right. So I was never able, again, the people would ask me what questions you want to ask Eddie. That would be one of the questions I would have wanted to ask, like, what was the living arrangements like? Where did you guys move? But eventually, I don't know if it was like Greg Brady gets his own room, but eventually Eddie moved. There was in the house on Las Lunas, there was a sun porch in the back.
I've seen it.
You've seen it. So that at some point became Eddie's room. So maybe there was, I think it was a 2-bedroom house, and they converted the third space there into another bedroom. So Alex had one room, he had the other.
And Mom and Dad
and so, one of the guys I interviewed for the book, who was, again, one of these guys who was a guitar player. Right. So Eddie kind of becomes this phenom 14-year-old guitar player, and like all the 16 and 17-year-olds were kind of going into Eddie's house to see this kid play. And one guy told me this great story. He said, I went into the bedroom, and Eddie had a record player, which he had taken the cover off of it, presumably because maybe the motor had broken or a belt had broken. He had to replace the belt. Okay. And he said that the whole room smelled like an amp, like an old Marshall, that it was running.
He said, smell the tubes.
Yeah, smell the tubes. The guy said the whole room smelled like an amp. And he said that Eddie, at that time, was learning stuff off of Yes, Fragile, of all things. And that was playing Roundabout or something like that.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, and I was actually really interested that he would learn that type of song. But
I don't know if you saw that when he did an article where he had all this gear. I forget which guitar magazine it was. And, aficionado, guitar aficionado.
Yes.
Where he mentions this Fender amp that he had, that he played and wrote all the songs.
Right, and
not the Marshall.
Right, and that was the Fender that they had in the bedroom, and he would take that out when when they would play a smaller place. They would take that out, and use the Fender instead of using the Marshall. But yeah, supposedly the guy that I said the guy had the Marshall. He had the Marshall head in the bedroom at the time. And then the other story along that same lines is somebody told me, it might have been actually Tom Broderick, who was
right there,
who was their tech for years in the beginning, and he talked about how like you'd come to the house and it's, hey, where's your mom? So Eddie and Alex would be playing, and the drum kit would be in the living room, this very small house, and they'd be playing and be like, oh, she's sleeping, and like they're like playing like Black Sabbath in the living room, and he's like, she's taking a nap or something like that.
Right.
And they were serious. Like I guess she would like, I don't know, she would like cotton her ears and the pillow on her head, and she was in her bedroom to sleep. So yeah, they
you can get used to that.
Yeah,
my wife used to sleep in the middle of my shows, which I was always like, what?
So there was so it was a very small space, and then the other anecdote to add to that is that Mark Stone would say that he would bring a space open, and they would practice in that living room,
in the front
room of the house. Again, this is when they were still just out of high school or in high school. They'd be like juniors in high school.
Yeah, I made a video where I talked the Van Halen Trail. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah.
But anyway, I made a mistake apparently, because you said they never practiced in the garage.
That garage, no, I don't think they ever practiced in, because it's so small. I don't think they ever practiced in it. Eddie used to paint his guitars in there, I think.
Yeah, have you seen those pictures from the inside?
Yes, with the paint splattered on the wall.
Yeah, there's actually overspray, black overspray.
Yeah, where he used to paint.
Which I was like, there's some paint.
Yeah, he probably used to paint the guitar. Yeah, the garage that they used to practice on, I don't think is standing anymore, but it's up in Altadena. So the pictures in Van Halen Rising, there's some pictures that were taken by a woman named Elizabeth Wiley. There were this woman who was friends with Dave Roth. I don't know if she met him at PCC or she had known him from the stables up there, but the basic story there was it was a rent house. She wanted it fixed up, and so she said to those guys, if you help me fix up this rent house, basically if you guys come and we'll paint a couple hours a day, you can practice in the garage. And so they would come and like paint the walls or whatever, help her rip the carpeting out of the house or whatever, like do like basically some manual labor stuff for her. They'd practice in this attached garage, but that's the garage they used to practice in. Yeah.
Okay, so before the Roth house, before that.
Oh yeah, right. Yes, this is before the Roth.
Before Roth was around.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
when Roth's around, but before that, I think Roth's father has purchased the house.
Right, the bigger house. Right. Okay. So the guitars themselves, we know they were hung up, painted, and striped in the backyard, right?
Yeah. So one of the guys I interviewed for the book, a guy by the name of Dave Shelton, who is still around, still playing. He's a great musician. He's on Facebook.
Right.
He's a great guy. He would in 78, 77, he met Eddie. He was a kid. He was like 16 or something, and Eddie kind of took a liking to him because he played guitar, and so he would go by the house, like drive by on his car, and he would stop in the alleyway, and he would see that he would go in the backyard, and he'd see that Eddie was out there, and Eddie would have the guitars hanging from the clothesline with a hanger, like he'd sprayed the guitars or whatever, like whatever he'd be doing to his guitars.
Did he ever say? I mean, because that interview Eddie did for Matt Brook and him did, where they're talking about the guitar and how he didn't really have any clue about what he was doing with the striping. He just did it.
Yeah.
I guess he never said to anybody else, anything about that.
Yeah, I don't think the ones that he was talking about were being striped, but basically he would be taking like a strap body and like painting it black or whatever. And he'd be like, and I don't think he saw them
just
being
random.
I don't know. I don't think he saw them being striped, if I remember correctly. But he said that Eddie would be like out there, like spraying, like they would be hanging out there, like he's like clothes off the clothes, like his mother's like schwank. Literally, his mother's like clothing would be hanging on the line, and there'd be like a guitar hanging on the line. So, but yeah, that was, and then of course, then Eddie's bedroom was right there. You could like walk into Eddie's bedroom. And they used to park the cars in the backyard. Supposedly, there was like the van.
They still do that in the backyard back there. They still pull in. And they re-fenced it. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm trying to think of some other things about Eddie in that house. Is there anything else that you could tell me that you hadn't uncovered, or that you didn't talk about in the book? That would be
well, the other story I like to tell about the house is that there's a guitar player named Carl Yahassis who was in Dred Zeppelin, and Carl was one of these guys who was playing on the same circuit as Eddie at the time, 74, 75, 76, and knew Eddie. And so what's a really funny story is that they used to borrow, these guys used to borrow gear from each other. And so at one point...
Because I remember the whole Chris Holmes, not only the guitar, not only the one from Diver Down, from Women's Children First, but the amplifiers. Yeah. There was some talk about some of those being the Marshall cabinets they would borrow. Yeah. For, they had balls of Marshalls. Right. But I know Eddie didn't own all those.
Yeah.
They were like borrowing this.
But so... Carl tells a story that they had a gig, his band had a gig, and they wanted a couple of marshals and a couple of extra heads to stack up.
Right.
And so this is like 76, so he goes, Eddie said, yeah, you can borrow it. I may not be there, just go and get it. And so Carl talks about he goes to the back door, he knocks on the door, his mother answers the door, Eddie's mother, and she's like, hello? And said, oh, I'm a friend of Eddie's. I need to borrow the amp. Okay. No. So he says he takes like the magic Marshall, like now that's like the one that's where like the Grail Marshall, and like they like throw it in the back of the pickup truck and they drive. And he says that when he tells the story, people are like, that's not true. There's no way. He's like, it was just an amp at the time. He's like, it was a great amp, but but he said
it was just the Grail.
Yeah, but he's basically said
everybody's like, oh God.
His mother's like, Eddie's not here. I'll tell him you came by. Have a nice day. And like he's taking like.
And every time that amp ends up in a shop or wherever, there's photos of whoever with that amp.
Yeah,
like it's the amp.
Carl's point was this, that at the time it was just, Eddie had obviously a great Marshall head, but there were a lot of great Marshall head in the time. And sort of at the time, the idea of like now like going to Eddie's house and borrowing his like famous Marshall. It's a sort of amusing story.
Just crazy.
But the other thing I'd say about Eddie is that pretty much anyone you talk to would talk about what a nice guy he was.
Yeah,
he was like very approachable, and you'd hear these stories that there's this rivalry with Randy Rhoads, and I actually, since Randy Rhoads is dead, there's no way, and Eddie's never really talked about it. But from what I've understood, they only played 1 or 2 gigs together ever, and there was, from what I understood, that was just sort of they just played together, and they may not have known each other very well at all, but. Talk to guys like Rusty Anderson, who now plays with Paul McCartney, and like Carl, who I mentioned, Gary and Carl, who both were in Dred Zeppelin as well. Talk about that Eddie was a nice guy, and they would talk to Eddie and like after gigs and like ask him how to pick his brain, like why do you do this? And he'd be like, oh yeah, I take my pickups and dip them in wax or whatever, kind of like talking.
He always seems like, to me, and I've met him, and he was great.
Yeah, so it was sort of this.
There's plenty of talk. But
sort of like he was the guy who was. Despite his sort of, I think knowing that he was the guy, even if he was not going to admit it, I think he knew he was the guy.
Right.
He didn't treat, from what I understand, other guys told me, he didn't treat those guys as second-class citizens. He was very approachable and nice to those guys and sort of supportive, like, oh yeah, where are you guys playing? Cool, I'll come down or whatever. And, whatever.
Yeah, you know what? And it made me think of George Lynch when you were talking about that because of the big story about Lynch's band being at the Starwood and they think this is their big night, and then Van Halen kind of takes it away from them. And so I guess Lynch, when he talked to you about Van Halen as a person, I think they hung out together. They went and saw, it was a Canned Heat? Or
they saw Canned
Heat. Mandel or whatever.
Yeah, so that was the whole Harvey Mandel thing. Right. Yeah, Lynch, when I talked to George Lynch about it, it's interesting because I think Lynch, in retrospect, now sees it just as sort of one episode along the way in his life, but I think at the time it was a tough pill to swallow that those guys that basically Gene had initially sort of gotten onto them first. They sort of seen the boys, which eventually kind of morphs into Dokken, but it sort of come on to those guys first, and then sees Van Halen and gets swept up in Van Halen. But he was. He's. You can tell that Lynch is a fan. He actually, I remember. I don't think I put this quote in the book, but I said something about, what do you think about Eddie now, or something like that? And he said, I just wish Eddie would just get an old Marshall and just get an Echoplex and just basically put on a Les Paul and like play, like he said, because he wasn't knocking Eddie, but he was saying that was such a remarkable thing. It's like when he would have this sort of, he was playing these Gibson, the Ibanez guitars, this before he did the whole Strat thing. He was just saying that when Eddie was, before he sort of became Eddie Van Halen, like even the pre-Eddie Van Halen that we all knew was famous, he said it was just so mind-blowing. He said, it was like, I just wish I could kind of see that one more time. But, there was definitely, these guys were all, trying to make it, so there was obviously going to be, there was going to be competition, but I never got the impression that Eddie treated any of these guys any way that they kind of look back and are like, that was a bad experience.
Well, I've always heard that too, exactly what you're saying. One more thing on Eddie, we'll go on. This last week, I put a post up about. We were talking about, of course, the tapping thing.
Sure.
It was. We know that there was tapping going on before Eddie, but what I said was that Eddie was able to take just about every technique that was out there and make that one big thing and be able to, at the drop of a hat, play 20 of those ideas or licks or harmonics and tap harmonics and whatever. Within one song, he could do them all, and just like every other line was something really cool.
Yeah.
Whereas, like if you're Billy Gibbons, you just were doing one tap, your drinkers and
Sure.
whatever. So he just was able to grab all of these techniques, even if it was from Mandel or whoever, and just turn them into this.
Yeah, and the whole Harvey Mandel tapping, if you've heard it, it doesn't really sound like the Eddie Van Halen tapping, and that was kind of the point I was trying to make in the book. Is like you said, it's just sort of the story that I was told by a number of people was that Terry Kilgore, who was one of Eddie's friends, and was kind of a friendly rival. Again, they were sort of neck and neck at the time in the backyards. This is '74.
And later, Kilgore played for David Lee Roth.
Right, and they were both in Pasadena.
Right.
That Kilgore ended up finding out that Mandel, who had been in Candy, he played at Woodstock, was living in a nearby town,
right.
And so Kilgore knew this guy was a really good guitar player. He goes, I'm going to go take some lessons from this guy. So we went up there and paid him whatever, $10 for 30 minutes, and we'd go up there and learn. And so
right.
One of the things Mandel showed him was to put the right hand on the fretboard.
Right.
And so one of the guys I interviewed for the book was actually working for Kilgore's band at the time, was basically one of their roadies, and said, yeah, I saw basically, again, showing him the basic, like the put the finger on the fretboard, not the eruption style tapping,
right,
just sort of this one thing.
Right.
And I talked to Kilgore about that, and he basically was like, yeah, I showed it to him, but the thing was that Eddie took it to a whole nother level, A and B. And he said the thing about that Eddie was so amazing was that Eddie could take anything and weld it to his style. And he said, Kilgore used this great phrase, he said there were no rivets, it was all smooth. So he said basically, like for example, the flamenco stuff on little guitars.
Right.
He said it doesn't seem like a guy who's like a heavy metal guy trying to play flamenco guitar, and you're like, you're sort of doing it, but it doesn't feel like it's like built into your style. He said whatever Eddie would learn, he had this way to sort of meld it in where it all made this very much this one whole, like you're kind of pointing out. So all the different, the harmonics, the tapping, the whammy bar, it all became part and parcel of this Eddie Van Halen style. And so that's what Kilgore was basically trying to give Eddie props to say, you know what, he took this thing and it didn't just become like this thing that he did, it became like a part of his style. And that was what was amazing about Eddie. He would be able to run with these things and take it to another level.
I just don't think anybody realizes. I know all the guitar players realize, but I don't think people really appreciate yet the level of the change that happened.
Oh yeah,
at that point.
Yeah,
that after that, and after Van Halen in general, everything that came after that was, some kind of variation on that theme.
Another guy I interviewed for the book, who I'm a big fan of, a great guy. You guys should all check him out on Facebook too. Tracy G, who played with Dio.
Right.
And Tracy was great to talk to because Tracy was about 16, and Tracy saw Van Halen at places like this, actually, like a Kane's Ballroom in Los Angeles. This sort of like open, these kind of these bigger ballrooms that were being converted from Western swing, basically dance hall, to rock bands, local rock bands. And this is Los Angeles, so you could get 1,000 kids into one of these clubs. And Tracy would talk about how he started to go see Van Halen play before they're famous. And he said, I became like a Van Halen junkie. I would go, even before I could drive, I would bum rides with people, and he would go and he'd see them on the Strip. And he was there on Sunset Strip in '77, around the time that Eddie sort of debuted the tapping, like the full eruption style tapping. And he said that all of it you could tell, he said you could tell who the guitar players were because they were all the ones with their jaws dropped, just standing there looking. And he said to himself, he already knew this. He said intuitively, he was like 17 or 18 at the time. He said, no one's going to catch this guy ever. He's like, because every time he'd do something, like he'd always add these new techniques or do something. He's like, wow, that's like really cool, the whammy bar or this or the strats or something. He said, once I saw the tapping, he said, I knew no one was ever going to catch this guy. He said it was just such a remarkable leap forward. Always these leaps forwards, and
with every hour.
And at the time, the only people who knew who Eddie Van Halen was people who were in Los Angeles, who were kind of like on the scene going to see Van Halen. They were a signed band in '77, but they didn't have an album out. And so Tracy, being a guitar player and sort of one who was really locked in on what Eddie was doing, was that when he saw the tapping and the whammy bar together, he said it was just so incredible. So Eddie was doing basically what became Eruption. Was all the pieces were there.
In '77.
Right. So they were recording the record, or just getting ready to record the record when he started doing it. Yeah, and so he said it was just amazing.
Let me ask you this, because this is another question about his technique that I noticed in the bootlegs. As I've gone through all the bootlegs, that '77, there's a point where he goes from this guy who's great to the guy we hear on that first record. It's like it all came together. The tapping, the harmonics, everything. Do you notice that in the bootlegs that progression seems to accumulate right there at that point?
That's another thing that Carl from Dred Zeppelin mentioned to me that kind of made that click in my head. He said the thing is that if Van Halen had been signed in 76 or 75, he said Eddie might have developed the style that he eventually developed. It may have made no difference, but he said the first record, he said the scraps, the whammy bar, the tapping, all kind of came together at that moment right before they recorded the record. He said that sort of was a historical accident.
Right.
He said, I don't, and I believe this. I don't think the only reason why Templeman wanted Van Halen was because of Eddie, but to sort of see all that stuff sort of come together in the summer of '77 before they recorded the record. So Carl's like, yeah, if they had gotten with Gene. He wasn't doing that stuff. It would have come out, it would have been like a cool rock record maybe, but sort of the whole guitar player, the guitar hero thing would not have been as big. And he said it was just sort of an accident of the way that the time worked. And
timing. Well, that's they say time means everything.
And the thing, too, I think, is that one of the things, if you're an NFL or an NBA fan, they always talk about the floor and the ceiling. What's this guy's floor? What's his ceiling? In other words, if a person enters the draft, are they sort of here with their potential, and their potential is now going to be up here eventually, or where are they going to end up? And sort of Eddie was this guy who had this enormous potential that had just barely been tapped, rather than kind of being in 76. Yeah. This is it. This is who you're going to get. He's not going to get any better. He got a lot better in terms of what he was able to bring to the table in terms of techniques.
And he really kept getting better.
Yeah, right. That's sort of the interesting thing is that, and that was Carl's point, was it's just sort of this moment that in 77 he was like, where Carl said that's where it sort of all came together for Eddie to become Eddie Van Halen, the guitar hero, where it was just like world sensation.
Right. Let's move on to David Lee Roth.
Sure.
You know what? The thing about your book and that I love the most about your book, it made me such a big fan of David Lee Roth. I was already a huge fan of David Lee Roth. But what made me a bigger fan with David Lee Roth was all the stuff you brought out about his desire, his drive, his direction for these guys. One of the funniest things to me, and it's the same thing I heard on your audiobook last night, was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but the famous haircut, Eddie Van Halen's haircut, was David Lee Roth's idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Yeah, so that what I was told by,
because I'm thinking the time Farrah Fawcett, the feather thing, and that's the haircut.
So let me tell you, the story is basically what I heard was that so David Lee Roth talks on stage on the 2012 and 2007 tour about his friend Stan Swantek.
Okay, yeah.
So I ended up interviewing Dave Swantek, was one of the brothers. There were the Swantek brothers, and they were very close with Dave. Right. And so Dave, before he's in Van Halen, would be hanging out with these guys with Red Ball Jet. They were kind of like, we're all like high school buddies. Right. And so Dave joins Van Halen, and Dave, at the time he joins Van Halen in 74, is really trying to start to get those guys thinking about fashion and about sort of like getting dressed for the stage. Right.
Because they're wearing t-shirts and jeans.
The story I heard, the anecdote I heard that I put in the book, one of the guys I interviewed talked about how like Eddie and Alex and Mark Stone looked like they cotton off work at the gas station and come and play. They would wear flannel shirts and stained jeans, and that's what they played. And it wasn't like that was their stage clothes. That was just what they wore all the time. And so Dave wants to get them sort of looking different. And so at some point, Dave was sort of getting on Eddie about his hair, kind of going like, who cut your hair, man? And basically what my understanding was that they would just cut it in the mirror, like it's getting long, and just get it out the scissor and kind of go down and cut your own hair. And so that Dave encouraged Eddie to go get a real haircut, like at a rock haircut or whatever. And so I'm not quite sure if it was the exact Eddie, the sort of the stereotype Eddie Van Halen haircut we all know, but it was basically like the first time Eddie got a real rock haircut. And so Eddie had prepped all the guys on the porch. David prepped all the guys on the porch to say Eddie's coming. Say all the guys are going to hang out here when he gets here, and they all were ready. When he shows up, they're like, Dave, check out Eddie's hair. And he's like, it looks amazing, man. And all these guys are like, Eddie, your hair is awesome. And I'm sure it looked better anyway. But but Dave was like really wanted to deliver the message to Eddie, that this is good. Keep doing this. Let's go in this direction. Let's not cut our hair in the mirror by ourselves. So
funny, man.
I think that was the thing that Roth kind of brought to those guys, was sort of a sense of, there's show business, and sort of, where we can be, I think our horizons can be bigger. I think that's one of the things that Roth never saw where they were as where they were going to end up. He may not have had a master plan to go, we're going to play stadiums, but I think, if they were playing a backyard, he wanted to play the Sunset Strip. If they were playing Sunset Strip, he wanted to play the Santa Monica Civic or something like that. He wanted to always take
your book illuminates one of the most, a couple funny stories about his classmates when he's in 7th grade.
Yeah.
He says he wants to be a rock star. He tells them.
Yeah.
In 7th grade.
Yeah.
And they laugh at him.
Yeah. You
think he's crazy.
I'll give you the numbers of the guys. You can call them up yourself and ask them yourself and tell you the same stories. Yeah. I mean, I think when I heard that, again, we talked earlier about the sort of the Van Halen legend versus the Van Halen truth, and sort of where that all kind of blends together. And that was sort of something where you read that, where Roth would say that I wanted to be I knew I wanted to be a singer in 5th grade, whatever he would say.
Right.
And in terms of what the exact moment was, I don't know in time. But by middle school, when they would go around the table, he was saying, I want to be a rock star, a rock singer or whatever. And these guys all laughed at him because it's crazy. It's like saying, like, I want to be president. You're like, okay, you're going to be president. Okay.
But he always it seemed like he always had a vision. Like you said, maybe not exact, but he was moving forward.
He had this, the thing was, for me, most illuminating about writing this book about David Lee Roth is that he was this guy who, no matter what setbacks he encountered, he had this amazing resilience to sort of, where a lot of guys were getting laughed at, were just seen, you're not good enough, you can't sing. I mean, people say to your face, you can't sing, man. And he would just go, okay, and just keep going and keep on going and keep on going, where that, to me, was just showed such an internal drive and such a, something that I would think, and I think rubbed off on all those guys. It's infectious to have that sort of confidence.
Right. He always had it. Yeah. And, like your book says, he tried out for the Van Halens 3 times.
Yes.
They told him no every time. And he come back a couple years later after he put his own band together. And they finally decide, okay, you got a PA system, we need a PA system. That's the famous story.
And the other great thing about that is that one of the reasons why the Van Halen brothers initially were kind of turned off by Roth is they thought he was weird. Like, he's just sort of this guy who he's wearing funny clothes on stage, right? They want to wear their jeans and t-shirts, and he's up there in these basically like little girl shirts, basically doing this glam thing. And he's like a senior in high school, and he's going, I want to be like the Stones. Right. This is what the Stones are doing. This is what David Bowie's doing. Why wouldn't I do that? And so they kind of thought that was, for lack of a better term, weird, right?
And you said he was into the glitter movement, which was the whole
so that was
strip deal.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is that eventually, as you're pointing out, in 73 or so, the brothers kind of realized, well, we kind of need this. Like, we need a guy who can attract attention, and we need a guy who can sing as well as he's going to sing, because let's face it, Eddie's not a good singer. I mean, that was, I always think was so humorous to me, is that, Alex and Eddie, or especially Alex, I guess, to Dave, you can't sing. And I'm thinking, Eddie is the one who says I couldn't sing. I mean, he couldn't sing either. It wasn't like he's like singing. We've heard Eddie sing before.
Right.
He's just like he can do his thing, but he's not a guy who's going to lead a band.
Right.
So there's sort of this humorous thing where they're like, they're like bashing Roth, and I'm thinking, well, you sound like
they weren't entertainers in the sense, especially they were just playing. They were doing what they do. Yeah.
They didn't have like Robert Plant up there and they see Roth and go, you can't sing. It makes sense. So.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So Roth just blew me away in your depiction of him through there. And then one of the other things about Roth was the difference in where Roth lived.
Oh, yeah.
His dad's 15,000 square foot mansion. They ended up practicing over there.
Yes, right.
Okay, and they live in like 800, 900 square foot home.
Yeah, it's small. Yeah, you've been by it. You've seen it.
Yeah, and they're not that far apart, maybe 4 or 5 miles.
Maybe.
They're pretty close together. But that is an amazing difference in the way you grow up.
So Roth, interestingly enough, we talked about some of the other residents. The Roth's father, that was a kind of the final home for them. They had lived in 2 or 3 other places, and again, they lived in bigger places than the Van Halen home on Los Lunas, but it was nothing like that. So they basically sort of, as Dave's father's medical practice became more successful, he purchased bigger homes. Eventually ends up buying the Monster Mansion and stuff like that. So again, another question I would have loved to have asked the brothers is said, what did you think the first time you drove on this property? It's like, come to my house, and they may have already known that he lived in the house. I'm not sure, but I guess you can imagine like rolling in there and being like, is there sort of this?
There's plenty of room to practice here,
right? And there was nothing but massive contrast between these two, and there's no other way to say it. It's just this massive contrast.
It's such a massive contrast, and then the guys, personality-wise, I mean, Roth. Everybody knows David Lee Roth from watching him. He's just a ball of energy, and he's all over the place, and he's hard to keep up with.
Look, that really worked out well for those guys because, like you said, it became a place where they could practice, and the practice locations were sort of tricky to pin down, but they didn't really have a steady place to practice until they got into that house, and then they could like camp out in that basement. There was a pool table down there they pushed against the wall. They put a chalkboard down there where they write the song names down there, and it became the famous basement, the David Roth and Van Halen basement where they worked on all the songs. And Ted Templeman talked about how he would go down there and before they did the record, or before they did the first 2 or 3 records, that's where they would do pre-production, that they would go down there and he'd say, okay, what songs are we going to do? And they'd let me hear this, and let's change this part, let's do this. But that was where they workshopped the songs and rehearsed and practiced. And yeah, that was a great thing for those guys, because it became their home base to really, I think, like for where you don't have to be like, well, we have to pack up our stuff and move, or we have to get out of here, or we can only practice for these 2 hours because X person is going to be home.
We got to go.
Right.
So going on to Alex, well, let's go do Michael, because I don't want to put Michael last. Everybody puts the bass player last, and my bass player, my butt, if I put him last. Michael Anthony, everybody, I've met him a few times, and he's just the nicest guy. You interviewed him for this book. I mean, what kind of stuff did he bring into this book for you that maybe we don't know about?
Michael was, of course, the guy who was successful to me, which was really, really great. And he heard the idea of the book, and he seemed to be enthusiastic about it and was happy to talk to me. And, I think the thing I really liked most about talking to him about it was that there was no awkwardness or weirdness about it. I know that's sort of...
Right, but he's that kind of guy.
That it's just sort of, because there's always all of this drama, right, around Van Halen with all who's in the band, who's out of the band, who's been kicked out, and sort of this whole thing. And we'll spare everybody the details to that. But it was just sort of like, he was like, yeah, man, it was a great... Basically, it was like, yeah, it was a great time. Like what's the problem? Like, there was, it was great. And talking about...
Well, he's one of the few out of all, probably the only one out of all, that seems to appreciate the retrospective of other career.
And he was really interested in, I think, kind of talking about the gigging. I mean, we talked, I remember a conversation, we talked a lot about, how those guys would be going all over the city, that they would, Michael had a station wagon at the time, the Van Halen brothers had this sort of Mystery Machine style van. It was this old Ford, sort of snub-nosed Ford van, and they would, they had like, I guess, different colored doors in the back. I don't know if they'd been rear-ended, so there was like, it was a blue van with like white doors in the back. And they would just pack up their stuff, and they would drive out to Downey and play in Downey. They'd pack up their stuff, and they would drive to Pomona and play in Pomona. And Michael basically talking about how they were working all the time, and just, that it was just that was the deal. That this was the way they were making money, and they were working the circuit, and they were hoping to continue to build a band. But that was so much of it. How hard those guys worked. I think Michael really, by talking to him, I really got to understand that. Wow, this is not just sort of like, hey, let's show up like 5 minutes from my house and like walk on stage and play. This was all day.
Yeah,
this is a full-time job these guys were doing with no promise they were going to get anywhere, obviously.
Right, and Eddie said that in the thing at the Smithsonian at the end when people were asking him.
Yeah.
We just busted our butt.
Yeah.
We just played and played and played and played and played, and your book says the same.
Right.
Their work ethic was, what it needed to be.
There were dozens of nights in a row at certain points in time. They would just basically work a Sunday. Oh, there's a birthday party. We'll play Sunday. And then they would play. They play the other days of the week, and playing everywhere they could play until they sort of got to be on the Sunset Strip, and then they started to play less because they were playing like these sort of like Thursday, Friday, Saturday at the Whiskey, and they were, which at the time, of course, probably was really helpful because it gave those guys a lot of time to rehearse and write songs where they weren't like going to clubs all over the city.
Right. It's when you play multiple nights, you play every week. It just as a player, I don't notice it as much, but it does sharpen you and smooths you out, and you don't notice the progression because you're just
you're
so in it. You don't even know. But it's a very important part of I think, and one of the reasons why I do this is to tell people, these are the processes by which people like Van Halen have become what they became.
Well, right. I think that's what you're kind of getting at too, is that to get that good of a band is from playing all the time. It's not from going, oh, well, we play in my bedroom and then we go out and play like once a week. You play 4 or 5 hours a night, 5 days a week, like they were doing. They were doing 5 45-minute sets. That's going to make you a good band.
And when you're at home, like Eddie was too, people, I think maybe it was in your book, somebody said he didn't get that good by just not doing anything.
Right.
He busted. He was always playing a guitar.
Right. That's another story.
His girlfriend said that in the book, right?
Kim, yeah.
And I kept thinking of that little cartoon that's around that's a little cartoon of Eddie and his girlfriend. Have you ever seen that?
I'm not sure.
It's like a funny thing where she's saying stuff and then the song answers the question.
I'll tell you a story. I'm not sure I put this story in the book, but before Eddie married Valerie, he had dated for many years, then off and on, a woman by the name of Kim Miller, who I interviewed for the book. And Kim talked about in 77, 78, something like that, Eddie was back from the road or whatever, and Eddie came over to her mother's apartment for dinner. So it was Kim, Eddie, and her mother. And her mother had gone to Sears to decorate the house or something like that, or wherever, Bloomingdale's. And they had this Japanese instrument that was basically a decorative thing that you would buy, that you would mount on the wall. So it was like a stringed instrument, but it was not a musical instrument that you'd buy in a music store. She said that Eddie walked over and pulled the thing off the wall, and Kim's mother's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, starting to like tune it up and play it, and she's like, "What are you doing?" It's from it's from Sears. Right, it's like I bought it at the furniture department at Sears, and Kim said Eddie was making music on, like he had basically fishing wire on it or something like that. And he was like had tuned it and was like making a melody on it, like. And she said, that's what she would say, like. When I would say, "Do you know how to play this instrument?" Or she's like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "He played like pretty much anything. Like he would just pick it up and like play with it for a while, and he had this amazing knack of like whatever instrument it was." Natural. But yeah, I thought that was such an amazing. She's in that sort of like always playing. Like he's like doesn't have his guitar with him for like a half an hour because they're at the house eating dinner, and he's like freaking out. So he sees this thing on the wall. But yeah, supposedly he would put it on first thing in the morning, and then play around the house, eating breakfast. Playing. It's just truth.
That's nuts. So, the dynamic between Alex and David, now, this is what I found interesting about the band, especially early on, is that Eddie was more or less, he didn't even pick the songs. He said he never picked the songs, but they picked the songs, or David picked the songs.
Right, the brother, yeah.
Alex kind of ran the business, right?
Well, Alex was, from what I understand, was sort of the biggest of the guys and sort of the meanest of the guys. I'm not saying like he was like a bully, but he was sort of like the more intimidating. Like Dave was not particularly intimidating or whatever. He might have been a good talker, but that if anyone was going to sort of throw punches, it was going to be Alex. Alex would be the guy you'd be like a little worried he was going to throw punches.
So he was the muscle.
Yeah, he was sort of the muscle. So he would, I understand he would collect the money some nights or whatever and stuff like that.
Make sure things went right.
Yeah, and I think that it seemed like Dave and Alex were the two guys, and again, that was something that was never 100% clear to me from writing the book, but it seemed like those two guys were the ones who sort of were the tag teaming, sort of running the band, that Mike and Eddie were much more of the reserved, laid-back guys, and those two guys sort of dealt with the sort of business aspect of it. A great story, this kind of gets at what we're talking about here, is that I interviewed a guy for the book who talked about how he hired Van Halen. He was a representative of his youth club, and he hired Van Halen to play at the Pasadena Civic, so one of these 1976 gigs. So it was like for a youth group, and so they were in high school. They were sophomores or juniors, and they had raised money for this concert. It was going to do some benefit for their club or whatever. And so they met with Alex, I believe with Alex, and so I don't think Eddie was there. It was just Alex, and so it was something like $200 to play. They wanted, and the guys didn't know how much. The kids didn't know, so they went and said, "Well, we want to hire you. How much you can charge?" $200, and they were like, "Man, that's a lot of money." And it's like, remember something about Dazed and Confused. Who do you guys think you are, Led Zeppelin or something like that? Like, apparently, Alex was like, take it or leave it. Don't waste my time.
Right.
And years later, the same guy got to meet Alex and spend some time around him, and the same guy, he's in his 50s, and he's talking to Alex, and he told him the story, and the story goes that he told Alex that exact story and quoted Alex to say, and then my friend said, "Who do you guys think you are, Led Zeppelin?" And the guy said he was sort of laughing, and Alex was like, kind of wasn't laughing at all. He was like, "Was I right or not?" So I don't think there's like a tremendous there's sort of an edge there, and the guy sort of said it was sort of like this, oh, okay, basically that was just this story that was just sort of like, okay, so I guess you don't you remember these things and you don't see them differently years later. He was still like, yeah, I was right. We were as good as Led Zeppelin. We just weren't we hadn't been signed yet. So
yeah, Alex, it's funny about Alex because you're right. He was seemed like the wildest one of all of them, and definitely the muscle. And they used to, there's all the stories of Eddie and him duking it out, fighting.
Yeah, Michael Anthony told me that himself. He's told it publicly, and I think Dave's told the story about how he wouldn't. They would fight, and then Alex was always very, very focused on trying to pin Eddie's hands down so that Eddie couldn't punch Alex in the face and break his hand or something like that. Basically, that was Michael Anthony's take on it was like, yeah, he's like, he didn't want to get punched, but he also didn't want Eddie to punch him and break his pinky or break his index finger, and then they'd have to cancel the gig. So yeah, they would go at it. And then of course there was a big, makeup session where they were like, "I love you, man," and it was all forgotten, but they were, it was a very intense brotherly relationship.
Well, yeah, because they came over and they didn't speak the language,
sure,
and they ended up, being
like
best friends, but also like
having
to beat your ass.
Yeah, blame me. I guess when they're. Yeah, the other Ted Templeman told me there's something like occasionally there'd be arguments in the studio, and those guys would kind of argue it out. But it was like but it was the arguments typically if there was going to be an in-band argument, it was between Alex and Eddie about a part. Like, you missed the part. No, you missed the part. Or whatever. In the studio, I was like, come on, let's take it. Let's do it again.
So another thing I want to talk about is Ted Templeman and Don Landine.
Yeah.
This is something that I don't know why it's only you and me. It seems like it's only you and me.
Well, a few other people.
I'm sure there's some other people that care. But Don was with Eddie and these guys from the very beginning.
Correct.
On the record recordings.
Right.
And even there was a pre-production version of the record of Van Halen 1.
The demo, right. So they did the demo.
They did one where they sat down and went through all the songs.
Right.
This is after the Gene Simmons demo.
Correct.
It's another demo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Don was involved from that point.
Yes.
And Ted.
Yes.
So pre-production
right.
for the record. And Don was with them all the way through OU812.
Correct, right.
As their engineer.
And beyond they did the Private Life record. So Don stepped away from the industry, best I can tell, around 1990. So right before the Fuck record, that's where Don seemed to just see. I think he had decided to step away from the record industry.
Did he ever tell you why?
I've never asked him why. I just assumed that there was a reason he had to leave, and that's why they got Andy Johns up there and Ted Templeman to do the Fuck record. But yeah, so there was a couple of records that they did with Private Life with Danny Johnson, the guitar player. And so the first one, if I remember correctly, Don and Eddie produced, and then the second one, Ted and Eddie produced. And so it's kind of interesting so that, even though the sort of classic narrative is that there's a falling out with Ted around 1984, Ted works with Dave on the EP and on Eat Up and Smile, and then Don stays with Eddie, and they kind of have these parallel tracks. Well, in 89 or so, that's when Eddie calls up Ted, and they finish the second Private Life record, and then Ted stays and sort of works on the Fuck record as well, and so kind of continue on.
Yeah, Templeman's continued, like you said. He was with David when they first made the split, and which was ironic because when we go back to the production of Van Halen 1, we were, I don't know how many people know this, but Ted wasn't sure that David was going to make it, and helped him develop his singing. And he took lessons.
Yeah, so the thing about Ted is, it's really interesting, as I'm working on this book on him, this is authorized biography, is that Ted is a really, really gifted musician himself. And so Ted started on trumpet, and then played drums, was a drummer, and then became a singer. And so he was in a group called the Harper's Bazaar, which had a couple of soft rock hits, and they were kind of like the Association, that type of like '67, sort of before like the acid rock psychedelic stuff really, really hit. There was that sort of moment in time, and they had a couple of hits. And so when Ted would work with these bands, I mean, he had a lot to bring to the table as a musician. He was playing jazz when he was a guy who sort of would play like solos at band concerts and stuff like that as a trumpet player. And so I think one of the things about Ted and Dave is that Ted had been a singer himself and sang. Yeah. And so he sort of was able to help coach up Dave. And yeah, the story goes that in '77, Dave's even talked about this in an interview, that he hired a vocal coach to basically help him. And I think because he sort of realized that the microscope was really going to be on him once he got in the studio, that, live, you can do your thing, you can sort of open your shirt, scream, swing your hair around, and kind of do your thing, and sort of, and so, but Ted has been, in my conversations with him, and I think interviews he's done, been very complimentary about the fact that Dave, really did a great job on the record and singing, that they had to work to get some of those parts down and get them right, but that ultimately what got on record was really good, that they got it nailed down.
Yeah, even if you listen to it soloed.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's so funny to hear those tracks, the isolated tracks of Roth. I think it sounds killer.
Yeah, and I think...
Even though people joked about it.
Sure, I think the thing too, I think it's funny because like a lot of singers, like Mick Jagger or Bob Dylan or anyone you want to talk about, there's sort of a style there. Yeah. And I'm not trying to compare Roth's singing with those guys singing, but so you sort of hear it. Carly Simon. He goes, when you sort of like you hear, you're like, oh, I know that is. And Roth, for all of his limitations as a vocalist, he wasn't Robert Plant. He wasn't.
He didn't have a super high range.
No, he wasn't. He's not Lou Gramm. He's not going to have that type of sort of classic rock singer.
Yeah.
He had a very identifiable style.
And a sound.
And the screams, Ben Templeman has talked to me about this. He's like, I never heard anybody do screams like that before. And he said that was like so cool to be like, that's going to come out of the radio when we hear those screams.
Right.
And that was part of all the sort of things kind of coming together. But to circle back to the original point, right? So that Ted, after they did the demo, so this would be basically just a few weeks after they signed. So they signed in February, and at some point, like a month or so after, they go into Sunset Sound with Don behind the board and Ted, and they lay down 25 songs just to hear all the material so Ted could review it and figure out, okay, we're going to make this record. What songs do I want on the record? And he said, like, he was listening to the cassette in his car, and he's like, I don't know about this guy. Like, there's just too many problems. Basically, there's pitchiness. There's basically his not hitting the notes. It's just not, the style he's singing is not, not, in Ted's estimation, something that was going to work, he thought.
Right,
so
he probably cut those live, right? So they were all live.
Right, the vocals were done. He said there might have been a couple of minor patches, but yes, he said that demo was basically like, right, there would be, he was in the vocal booth singing along, and then if there was something that he really screwed up, they would like went back and patched it, but he said there were very few patches on the demo. Right. And he said that, I was worried, and so they said the guy I immediately thought of was Sammy Hagar, who Ted had produced with Montrose. He'd done 2 records with Montrose. Right. And, Ted said he didn't, there was no big grand conspiracy to kick Dave out of the band. It was just something like, what if I get this guy in the studio again and he can't do it? Like, he just can't deliver. Like, what am I going to do? And so he's like, well, I want this band to work. And so, but the other thing I would emphasize is that Ted has been very clear to me to say, if I had actually said this to me fairly recently, he said, if I had kicked David Lee Roth, if I had basically done this, which I never even got close to even actually moving towards doing this at all. He said, if I replaced Roth with Hagar, he said it would have been the biggest mistake in rock history. He said he said I would have made the biggest mistake in the history of rock and roll. He said it was just, at the moment in time, you just don't know what someone's potential is. This is the first time I've been in the studio, I heard this, and I go, this to me is not going to hold up. And so, again, working with Ted, to basically sharpen his own chops, Roth delivered on the Van Halen record. I think he did great.
I mean, think about that album.
It's amazing.
And if he was worried about it, they just killed it.
Yeah, they killed it.
When it came out. I mean, that album's incredible. And Don, I don't think Don gets credit because, they always say, I just stuck a 57 in front of the cabinet and I turned some reverb. No. I don't think so. There's a lot more to engineering than what, I know they think it's that simple, but really that album, the sound of it is
So, let me talk to you a little bit about Don Landy. Yeah. So Don Landy is a guy who, very modest.
Yeah.
Right, and you kind of can see, I think, I don't know Don well, but what of my interactions with Don, I would tell you that seems like a fairly introverted guy, kind of like maybe a lot like Eddie, like a guy who's not going to blow his own horn. It's not going to be like.
I've only seen one picture of Don.
Yeah, right. So you get the idea. So Don is a guy who's very, very much sort of low key.
Yeah.
And Don had started working in studios as far back that Don worked on one of the sessions for Waiting for the Sun. For the Doors, like when he was basically like a 20-year-old kid. Right. So by the time Don got in the studio with Van Halen, he had done Doobie Brothers, Van Morrison, Carly Simon, Little Feat. He had done all of these records.
In Montrose.
He'd done some Everly Brothers sessions. So Don was a guy who was fairly young, was a very, very seasoned engineer, and so it wasn't just sticking a 57 in front of that. That whole sound of that record. Yeah. Is Don Landy.
Yeah,
and basically Don getting those sounds on tape, and then Ted and Don mixing the record to sort of make that soundscape. But that came out of Eddie's amp, but there are engineers who would have made it sound nothing like that because
just listen to the Gene Simmons demo.
Right.
I mean, it's not even in the same realm, and that album still sonically holds up. You can put it on today, and it sounds like as good as anything you hear.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing too. I would say about Don, if you listen to any Doobie Brothers record. Right. Listen to Stampede. I mean, these records are sort of, the Doobie Brothers records, for whatever reason, I think because they're so much a part of, like, rock radio, it's like, who's going to listen to 404 when you've heard Head Games, like, 10 zillion times? It's like, who wants to listen to, basically, The Captain and Me, maybe because I've heard China Grove or whatever record.
Right.
But listen to those records on headphones and how great they sound. They're amazing. The guitar, the textures, the acoustic guitars, all the percussion that Don got, that Ted was really into percussion, so there's a lot of conga and a lot of other stuff on those records, and it's all Don getting all that stuff on tape, and so,
or the accidental and Unchained,
right,
or give me a break, it's all accidental.
So, if I have no idea if Don would ever see this, but I would say that Don doesn't blow his horn enough, and I'll blow it for him. He was tremendous. And Ted would be the first person to tell you that without Don, Van Halen never would have happened. He said if I had had another engineer in there, somebody who I was stuck with who would not have been as good, it would not have happened because it wouldn't have the record would not have been transcendent like it is without
translated
Don.
That way. It's and even the live videos, the ones that inspired me to pick up the guitar were mixed by Don.
Yes, that's correct.
Those 81 videos that we all want so bad.
Recorded by Don Landy.
Yeah,
with a Wally Hyder mobile truck in Oakland, California.
It sounds great too.
Kind of explains that, doesn't it? Yeah.
It just sounds just great too. So let me take you through one more little thing we're going to do. I want you to give me just a short synopsis on the 6 Van Halen albums, the first 6.
Oh God! Okay.
Just give me just whatever it is that sticks out to you on Van Halen 1.
Sure.
Give me one thing off that album and something maybe if it connects to your book.
Sure. I think one of the things that's interesting is about Van Halen 1 is that there are a lot of songs to choose from, but Ted decided to use Ice Cream Man. And one of the things I sort of realized in writing the book was that captured sort of Roth's bluesy voice, but also it sort of put Roth out there kind of naked, and that for me, it made me understand that at that point Ted had confidence in Dave to kind of pull this off, because he could have been like, oh, I don't want this guy with an acoustic guitar, but he said, you know what, this guy's got some style, he's got this sound, he's got this thing going on, let's let him have his sort of showcase. And that's sort of beginning of Ice Cream Man, sort of the Dave Lee Roth showcase. If you have Eruption, showcases Eddie, that's, again, it's not the same type of technical, obviously, guitar playing, but it's him on the acoustic guitar, it's his vocal comes through really, really clearly, and for me, that was evidence that Ted was sort of sold. He's like, we don't need to sort of try to mix this guy up in a way that doesn't, that he's not denigrating the rest of the band. He's there, he's doing it, and he's going to be, I want him to be highlighted in that sort of way.
Right. Another thing that I noticed about Van Halen 1, just to kind of go back to Templeman, is that if you listen to some of the demos of Run with the Devil, the way they sing that melody, and later they even sang it not like the record. I don't know if you noticed that at the US Festival. But I know that Templeman came in there and helped them shape their melodies and put together that's what producers do.
Right. And that's the type of thing too that
and you can listen to the bootlegs.
That the good record producers are gonna let the artist's identity kind of shine through, give them the best sense of themselves. Basically do everything they can to make everything as good as it can be. Right. And I think that's where, Ted would Somebody Get Me a Doctor, that riff that got turned around. There was a sort of that opening riff gets changed around. Right. All that type of stuff is the stuff that you hear that's sort of oh, the tempos, but basically the parts, they sort of the smoothing out the parts, and that's the type of stuff. Ted said he had this notebook where he would go in the basement, he would take notes on things, and he'd be like, okay, we're going to change this, and kind of come back and talk to those guys and say, hey, what if we did this? And he said that they were, he said, it's interesting, he said, because this becomes this all the story of all this tumult in the band, he said they were great to work with. He said they, especially with the first record, he's like, I'm a record producer, and I'm an executive of the company. He's like, so it was like, yes, sir, Mr. Templeman, no problem, Mr. Templeman. He said, I wasn't trying to control what they do, but he's like, they were so open to my suggestions, and they happened to be good suggestions, obviously.
And he, like you said, he had a background in all different things, musical, so and he also did all those other records, so he had a lot of experience. Van Halen, one more thing on that, Eruption. Give me your thing on it. What do you say about it?
The thing that's amazing is it just sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. It just doesn't sound. There's so much guitar that I hear, even Hendrix, right? It sounds. It's incredible, but it very much sounds of the time. And for me, when I listen to Eruption, if we put it on the speakers here and blasted it through here, it doesn't sound like from the 1970s. It just sounds like it's from a different. It's sort of out of time almost type of thing. And so that again, getting it how great Eddie's playing is, and then the way it was recorded, and so it's such a unusual. I mean, there are always there are some timeless pieces of music, but there are not a lot of them, and for that, especially in the rock context, that's one that sort of doesn't sound at the time.
Right, no doubt. Van Halen 2. I know we're going to go out of your book.
Oh, I can handle life.
You're a super fan. I know you can handle all this.
Yeah.
Van Halen 2.
Van Halen 2. What's really interesting is that one was done faster than Van Halen 1. Right? They had to go work even faster because they were going to go back out on the road. The thing for me is how poppy Dance the Night Away is, and as one of my friends recently observed, I was talking to him about it, how titling the song "Dance the Night Away" fit very well into the disco era with my Saturday Night Fever shirt. Right, it's not a disco song, but yet it's sort of like this dancing, going out to dance was like this big thing. It's sort of like this clever thing, whether it was planned or just sort of part of the culture at the time. And this, Dave came up with the line "Dance the Night Away," but the how poppy that song is, and so how radio ready it was with the harmonies, and sort of it fit so well into.
You know what that makes me think of? Dancing Queen.
Yeah.
And only because of the treatment of the vocal and sort of the feel.
Right. The whole
poppy feel.
And the way they made, and the way they were sure, and Ted was sure, to make sure that there were a good single. I mean, I think that the next record doesn't have that same type of single, but Ted told me this, and it's in Van Halen Rising, was that he had been through with Montrose where they made this incredible sounding, kick-ass rock record, but they didn't have a single. And he said that's why the album eventually went gold, but it went gold like 20 years after it was released. And he said, I knew that if I ever had a band that reminded me of Montrose, we had to have a song. So You Really Got Me. And then the second record, Dance the Night Away, said something that's going to be on radio to really make sure that the album doesn't get sort of lost in the shuffle of stuff. But that's sort of it's sort of out of character with the rest of the catalog in some sort of way. So it's so poppy. You get the jump later, but to sort of again have the dancing and the high to disco is interesting.
Well, the Templeman quote that's so famous, I guess, in our circles is that it's a cover song. It's halfway there, or most of the way there. And Van Halen's had such a way of covering that it just made the songs
and Ted's actually like, that's right. He said that's right. There's some interesting stuff that I'm going to put into the book from my conversations with Ted about the whole cover song debate with Van Halen. Right. Ted has his own take on what's been said about that, but cool. But he definitely said I mean they were doing You Really Got Me. Yeah. So in the clubs, and Ted heard it and said we should put it on the record. It wasn't Ted's idea to go, we need a cover song. Okay. So it was that was one that he actually, his memory is that he heard it at the Starwood the first night they were doing it, and this is good. The other thing that is worth remarking about that, as long as we're on the subject, is that Mo Austin was there with Ted that night at the Starwood, and Mo had signed the Kinks.
Okay.
To Warner Brothers. Okay. So when Mo heard the song, he's like, I like that song. Like Mo Austin's like the classic. He's like, I like that song. That's a good song. And so if the president of the company likes the song, it's probably a good idea to sort of record it and see whether it's going to fit in the record. So that was one of the ones that, That's wild. And so, so you have Dance the Night Away, very poppy.
Women and Children First.
Women and Children First for me, again, there's not a classic radio single on that record. Now, Cradle of Rock is just such a great anthem. Yeah. The keyboards, I mean, for me too, the sort of the piano and sort of that beginnings of what's going to become this big turning point for Van Halen, that it's sort of built into the mix there, but it's built into the background. To me, that's always the thing to me. There is sort of the seeds of what later would become a totally different direction of the band were there. Right. In late 1979 when they record it, they come off the road, they record in 1970. Then even like 1979, Eddie's banging on the piano and wants to put it in the context of a Van Halen song. But that for me is what stands out about that.
That's cool,
record.
And one of the things that I noticed over the years with Eddie and with these albums is that you get the David Lee Roth segue talking parts, like Rock On or whatever in Cradle of Rock, everybody wants some. Yeah. He had these little signature things. Then you had Eddie with these little signature leads or solos or whatever they were. Every album had these little nuggets that were unique to them.
Ted, one of the things that Ted told me is that he said, we'd have to fix vocals sometimes. So you record the record and they would have Dave singing in the vocal booth. So they'd be in the room, the guys, Dave would be in the vocal booth. Alex, Eddie, and Mike would be out in the big studio room, and they said that he would always have Dave sing with them because he said it was like the big bad wolf because Dave would make faces and make those guys laugh, and you would get these have you seen Junior's grades, and all these little things would kind of come out occasionally, and they'd be like, Don would have that on tape, and then if they had to fix a verse or something that David flubbed or someone, they would go back and fix it later.
Well, that's great. You get those improvised.
Right, but he said that it was so important to have those four guys playing together. Some bands would record where they would have the instruments play, guys basically lay it down, and they'd have someone go back and sing the vocal later. But he said he always wanted them at least to go through the songs the rough first couple times with
record
Dave.
That and make sure you might have whatever comes out of that.
Right.
Fair warning.
Yeah, fair warning. I mean, talk about the left turn for people with the the introduction to Mean Streets, again, that's sort of what I was talking about earlier about Tracy, the guitar player, saying that, no one's ever going to catch this guy. It's like suddenly, now he's doing thumb tapping, like bass slap tapping on the guitar. And again, that's another one of those things that when you listen to it, it doesn't sound as if it's of 1981. It's sort of this weird piece of music that's sort of outside of time. It just doesn't, to me. There's so many records that sound of the decade, and that's partially from the producer, the engineer, but also the playing. The playing is so transcendently great.
Right.
It's not something that just seems to me that you can go, oh yeah, that's in the 80s or that's in the 70s or the 60s, right? And so,
not about Mean Street.
Yeah, I mean, and so the riff, and that's another one too. There's a great example too. We were talking about the demo. Of course, that goes back to that riff. That whole song goes back to the first Van Halen demo with Voodoo Queen. Another one of those ones that you can sort of hear the evolution of the song and basically how from those guys working it and changing some parts around and sort of everything. The other thing that Ted told me is really a great anecdote too, or great observation actually, is that he said they were very modular. He would say, hey, what about this piece of this song? We could kind of change the key and plug it in here. Play the riff in G and let's play it in this song from this song. And he said they were like, Eddie was he said, oh yeah. And he and Alex would just sort of immediately go and get it there. And he said, boom. And he said that's what was great. And so like some of the earlier Van Halen songs, you sort of hear pieces of this song got pushed into pieces of this song. And he said they said that they were just so, he said some bands you work with and that would screw up everything. And they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, he'd be like, no problem. Let's just do this. And they would keep going. So Mean Street's one of those songs that sort of got a couple songs pushed together. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing that in the early demos. That's amazing. So on to Diver Down.
Yeah, Diver Down. I'm a big fan of Dancing in the Streets, and I always put once every 6 months I'll post something about that on Facebook, and unless it'll explode with like 500 posts thing of all these people. It's terrible. It's the worst song they ever did. But one thing I getting back to this, I really like about that is that if you listen to the bass line, it's Michael Anthony's bass line. It's basically like a disco bass line.
Yeah.
That it's this great performance by Mike. I just think the vocals are great, and Alex's drum part is incredible. I actually think that Alex, in my estimation, got better as time went on. He actually got to be a more technically good drummer as time went on. And by Diver Down, especially that song, it's an amazing drum part. Right. And so, I'm a big fan of that song. I do think it's sort of a one that gets a lot of hate for whatever reason for fans, but that's my least favorite Van Halen song. People will say it. I'm like, are you crazy? I love that song. So
I said in my post last week that it was an argument about Guns N' Roses. It was on Trunk's show where they said Guns N' Roses, Slash and Axl against David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, which is the better pairing? And I was like, first of all, that's 6 albums, and I said, to me, no filler. But people were like, oh, there's filler all over. What about Big Bad Bill? I was like, that was genius to me. Big Bad Bill.
Big Bad Bill.
Or Happy Trails at the end.
Let me tell you what I think about Big Bad Bill. I think one of the things I was saying earlier about Eddie and about how you could not see the welds on his guitar parts. Like he'd adopt a new technique and he'd sort of stick it in there, and as Terry Kilgore points out, it would be all smooth. And,
right.
Let's just be real here. It's a 1920s jazz big band song that Van Halen made sound great, in my opinion. It's awesome. Like Dave had something like he smoked like 1 million cigarettes and drank like half a gallon of Jack Daniels. He had his voice, and he's playing this like jazz guitar. Like that should not have worked. Okay, that should have been horrible. It should have been something that had been recorded by a normal band, and the producer would go, no, we're not putting that on record because you guys want to have a career, right? It's like going to be a joke if you put this on the record, but it's great.
And his dad played on it.
Dad played on it, and for them to pull something like that off, it just goes. They were like Zeppelin. Zeppelin could do the same thing. Zeppelin could play a polka, and it would sound cool, right? That was just the way they play folk music, they play rock music, they play blues, they play jazz, whatever Zeppelin would sort of do when they would jam on stage. It all sounded like Zeppelin, and that's the same thing with. So for me, I mean, that's another strong opinion I have about Diver Down is that Big Bad Bill is a very good song.
I know. I just some people. I mean, I love Where Have All the Good Times Gone. It's another cover.
Sure.
It's just that album was great to me, and actually it was an accidental because I saw the Unchained video and I thought that was the album it was on because you didn't know.
Oh yeah. Sure.
I didn't know what the name of the song was. I just saw it once. Right. So I went and bought that album. Of course, it was really my first exposure, and then started back catalog and everything else.
Your entry drug, right?
Yeah, right there. So let's go to '84. But before we get into '84, you and I both saw the 1984 tour as our first Van Halen experience.
Where'd you see him?
I saw him in Birmingham, Alabama.
Yeah, January.
That man back there was my driver to the show, and he went to the show as well.
He's still driving around.
Not really, I'm driving.
Okay. The tables have been turned. Well, you did the job early on.
So he went to the show with my sister, and I went with my friends downstairs, and we saw Van Halen in 1984.
Yeah.
You saw the same show.
I did.
Where'd you see it?
I saw it in the Meadowlands, so I saw it in April. You saw him in January.
Yeah, I did. Right. First, what was wild about that was they announced the concert in December. We had a big ice storm, and it was just a month later.
Yeah.
And there they were. And so it was an awesome show. And that album, and the necklaces and all the merchandise and all the stuff.
T-shirts.
And you wear the one with the baseball sleeves.
Right. And you wash it once and it's 3 sizes smaller.
Right. It's gone, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about that experience for you at that concert and that album for you.
Sure.
You said Jump earlier as your...
Yeah. So the thing for me was that I heard Jump. I bought the 45. I don't remember why I didn't have money or whatever. I didn't have the money for the record. I may not have had it. I probably went to the mall with like $4 in my pocket, and the record was like $5.98, and I bought the single because it was like $2.25 or something.
Right. So
I flipped it over and I heard House of Pain. That was the B-side.
Right.
And I was like, wow. That was sort of like turning on the guitar thing. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And that's sort of like that's an album track that probably not many people even listen to.
Right.
But ended up getting the record, and I go to the concert. My mom drove me to the concert, and it just was, I still can remember the lights go down, and they had this thing with the spotlights. So they sent all around the room, and they had this, give you the mighty Van Halen, and Roth comes off the drum riser, and Eddie comes running out a million miles an hour, and it was such a sensory assault. I mean, that was really what it was.
Yeah.
14-year-old, I'm sure I didn't have earplugs, and it was probably the loudest thing I've ever experienced in my life. I didn't know any better to have earplugs, and to see that, and just to see, especially what Roth could do with controlling this room of people. I don't know controlling, but basically he had the crowd in the palm of his hands. He could say something, and people would laugh, and people would scream. Whatever he did, it was just such a amazing entertainment experience. And you walk out and you go, that was like the best thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm 14. I haven't seen a lot, but that's the best thing I've ever seen.
Well, there was, as far as their sales, they're selling out every show.
Right.
Every single show, multiple nights, everywhere they went.
That was full,
even in Birmingham, Alabama, where I saw them, it was totally sold out.
And that was a big, that's a big arena. That was, some of them were like 12,000, 10,000. That was probably 18,000 people. Yeah. So Madison Square Garden was bigger. I think it holds like 20-something thousand. So that was 2 nights. And
amazing.
Yeah. So 1984, though, you want to talk about the record. I think for me, what's interesting about 1984 is how long it took to make it. That they actually, in writing the Ted Templeman authorized biography I'm working on now with Ted, that they actually started working on it before the US Festival. So basically, like in April, and they're working on Jump. They're starting, and so it took months of and it wasn't every day working
like
on
their
it,
other albums.
but it was such a different recording process, and there's a whole, of course, backstory to that going up to the house and stuff like that. But it's interesting is that all the other records were done in a very short period of time. They were basically 3 weeks, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it was, and they would do these records at Sunset Sound, or Amigo, which is the Warner Brothers studio in Hollywood. But then when they go up to Eddie's house, it becomes this much more drawn-out process, which has its positives and its negatives. I'll say that. And so that's, to me, it's really interesting, is that it's not this sort of, well, we have the record together, let's do it. They were working on things like, oh, wait, some of these other stuff took a long time to get together and get right, or get on the record.
So, yeah, the 1984 record, they're up at 5150 and moved into the Eddie's studio.
Right.
Was there anything else about that process with Don and Templeman that I can't remember exactly what they said about whether that was different for them than Sunset? Or
I think what I would say about it is that from Ted's perspective, I think Eddie was really, first of all, Eddie was really interested in recording in the studio that they wouldn't have to pay anymore for the bills or whatever. And the albums never cost a tremendous amount of money, but they still cost money to rent Sunset Sound.
Sure.
They were doing them fast. But also that Eddie was extremely proud of the studio, that Don had wired it up. And he was like, this was sort of a big thing for him to say, I have my own studio. Like,
sure, back then it was...
Right. I've gone from being a kid who played guitar in my bedroom and tried to record it with a cassette deck, having actually a 16-track studio in my backyard. And so that Ted was open-minded about it. But I think that the flip side of that, of course, is when it's you're not on a schedule. it becomes more challenging to complete things, and there became much more of a different vibe for working up there.
And that's kind of today's thing too. Pro Tools.
Right.
If you could go on for ever and ever.
Right.
And the part of the problem is that like when I go into a space where I pay, we get that done.
Sure.
We're on a schedule.
Right.
And it's costing money, and that clock's running. So there's something about that not only helps you create, but it focuses you.
Yeah, it should get you very, very focused. And I think the other thing that I've heard Ted say is that he said, the thing was, he said, we had access to Sunset Sound.
Yeah.
So from Ted's perspective, no offense against 5150, they made a great sounding record. Right. He said, why would we not use Sunset Sound with the Stones, Zeppelin, these bands fly from England to work at Sunset Sound because it's a studio. We can go in there and do the record there. Why would we do it in your backyard? And again, it was not. I think he knew that Eddie and Don were very proud of this and they wanted to use it. And he was like, okay, we'll use the studio. But to him, he's thinking, okay,
maybe they just wanted something new, to kind of inspire them in that. So the song on that, you said "Jump" was your song.
Yeah, "Jump" was the one. I mean, that was the first song I can definitely remember I heard on the radio. I think I probably heard "Pretty Woman." Yeah. On the radio, but yeah, "Jump" was the one that hooked me to Van Halen. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, "Jump" is amazing. I still play it all the time. Played it this weekend, and people still love it. It's still got that big keyboard sound. And it was amazing at the time because nobody expected that.
No, it was definitely out of left field for Van Halen to have that sort of come out. And one of Ted's funny quotes he told me was that. He said that they were discussing the song, and there were some disagreements about the song along the way. And Ted may have said something like, "It just sounds like something you'd hear at a stadium." Like basically because it's like so like keyboardy, like almost like a baseball organ. Right, and he said that he was right. He said I said that, but he said even that's what made it. In some ways, that's what made it an anthem. He's like they do play it at stadiums. He's like I was just so that I had it sort of backwards that I was thinking of it as this thing like it just sounds like too much like I don't like it for Van Halen. Right. Where he said it became this Van Halen anthem that now like you go to a football stadium. He says you go there and it says USC's playing and they crank it through the stadium speakers at the Rose Bowl. He says it sounds awesome. He's like it became this anthem. But
and Renoff didn't like it either, right?
Yeah, there was I think.
Didn't he have a lot of that comment that everybody says you're a guitar hero, man? What are you doing?
The thing was that I think at first it was such. Again, I can't speak for these guys 100%, but my take on the situation is that for Roth and for Ted, it was so different in such a left turn that it was just seemed like it was going too far afield from what Van Halen was. That you can sort of that you can evolve, and that all the Van Halen records sort of had these different pieces that there's sort of this evolution along the way. But this became it seemed like such a left turn that it was going to take Van Halen too far afield from what and in some ways it did. In some ways, we look at 5150 was sort of a step towards that. But I think that at first, if I remember correctly, Roth was having trouble getting a handle on it. Like basically, he couldn't quite at first kind of grab on how to work with it. But once he got it. He figured out they worked out the lyrics and everything and the melody and everything just sort of came together. But that was again I would emphasize a song that was worked on for a tremendous. I mean I don't know when exactly it was finished, but it was basically started in April and the album doesn't come out until January, and so it went through a lot of permutations of different experiments along the way before they kind of got it.
There is that interview where he's playing the riff to somebody on the phone.
Yeah,
I've heard that before. Yeah. So when they go to this seems like so interesting to me that when Jump. Who came out, it was such a left turn. But when they put out Tattoo on the latest album, Different Kind of Truth album, there was more of the controversy. Like, what is this? I loved it personally. I thought it was right down that same path, but people were like totally freaked about that.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that song. Actually, that's like I'm going to skip. That's the song I typically would always skip on that record. But
well, just which one's your favorite on that record?
On A Different Kind of Truth.
Yeah.
I'd probably say Honey Baby Sweetie Doll.
Oh, that's mine.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, Chinatown.
Yeah, or Chinatown. That's
I was with the engineer, Ross Hogarth, who recorded that album. He brought the raw tracks to a thing I went to, and he pulled up the solo of that song, and he played it, and I went, "There's no punch-ins in this, is it?" And he's like, "Nope, that's all live. That was a live solo that he cut on the fly, and no, there was nothing done. Straight up live.
Classic Eddie Van Halen.
Like he always did. Amazing stuff. Man, I really appreciate you coming. Tell the people on my channel about your next project. We already said it, but when's that going to happen?
So next year it's going to come out from ECW Press, the same press that did Van Halen Rising. It's going to be Ted Templeman's authorized biography, and I'm going to track. It's going to be based on my conversations with Ted and kind of track his life from a kid in Santa Cruz, California, to becoming this jazz obsessive as a young kid, and then eventually getting up in this group called Harper's Bazaar, ending up at Warner Brothers, becoming a A&R guy, discovers the Doobie Brothers, ends up producing Doobie Brothers, Little Feat, Carly Simon, Montrose, Van Halen. You can go down the list, and I can keep going and going and going. But he had this career, and what's another interesting track is that Ted also went from being, again, a tape listener, a guy who would get these cassettes in the mail and like put them in a cassette deck and listen and be like, oh yeah, we should try to find out more about this band, to a guy who became an executive vice president, one of the top people at Warner Brothers. So he had I thought this great story of his path through the record industry. But I wanted to be able also to kind of get more into thinking about how these records got made, and sort of talking to Ted about how he worked with the Doobie Brothers through all their different permutations, where they, Tom Johnson leaves, Michael McDonald comes in. There's all these different work along the way to kind of keep these bands going in some ways and keeping them successful, and how you, as a producer, you sort of deal with the left turns. The sort of guys like, oh, we're going to do this. And is this going to work or not going to work? And so I'm thrilled. I think Ted is a highly underrated figure in the history of music, and it's been just a joy to be able to talk to him about this stuff. And he's got so many great stories from his whole, again, from being a pop star in the '60s with Harper's Bazaar up to being, the guy who's finding the Doobie Brothers and putting them basically in a position to get signed by Warner Brothers. It's really a great story.
So many amazing albums that he was involved in. It's just amazing. We're actually sitting on the stage that Montrose played here in 1978, and Van Halen opened.
Yes,
for that show, right? You said that was a journey tour, but they took aside to come here and play. So
just to take everything full circle with Ted, is that Ted met Ronnie Montrose when Ted produced, or co-produced, Tupelo Honey with Van Morrison. Ronnie Montrose had been hired by Van Morrison to be his guitar player. So that's where Ted met Ronnie. And Ted said, Ronnie went and did his own thing for some time, but he had said, hey, if you ever want to get a band together or something, call me. And then Ronnie called up and said, hey, I got these guys. I want to get this singer, Sam Hagar, and check it out. And brought him basically a demo, and was like, yeah, let's do this. And they made the first Montrose record.
That all happened, and they ended up back with, he ends up actually in Van Halen eventually. Such an amazing story, man. Thanks for your time today.
It was great. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to come to Tulsa and have an opportunity to talk to you in person. And man, this book, man, if you do not have this book, get it. Get it on audiobook. If not, listen to it in your car. I got both, and I love it. So thanks again for hanging out with us on Musical Journeys, episode number 19. Greg Renoff.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, buddy.
No problem.